Welcome, everyone. My name is Matthew Garrett. I'm a professor of history at Bakersfield College, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest this evening. But first, let me state that tonight's event is hosted by the Bakersfield College Renegade Institute for Liberty, which is a coalition of faculty who seek to provide a forum for rational inquiry, open discourse, and viewpoints that are increasingly unwelcome in higher education. Tonight, we will enjoy a lecture, and then I will facilitate a question and answer session with questions that our viewers can submit in the Q&A box. If you find this event to your liking, I hope you will subscribe to our fledgling new YouTube channel, or even better, make a tax-deductible donation to the Renegade Institute for Liberty at Bakersfield College. Your donations enable us to host these and other events. Tonight's guest fits squarely into the Renegade Institute's mission, and it is of particular relevance at Bakersfield College, where we're struggling with our own free speech crisis of institutional censorship. What are the limits of permissible speech? What are the issues that we can debate? And in what ways are those conversations suppressed? These are the themes I suspect will emerge as we enjoy our guests this evening. I am tickled to introduce tonight's guest, Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. She's a professor of anthropology at San Jose State University. She earned her master's in anthropology from CSU Sacramento and her PhD from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. Her research centers on post-cranial skeletal morphology. Basically, she uses CT scans and X-rays and other methods to study skulls in order to reconstruct the lifestyles of past populations, often Native Americans. She frequently presents at some of the most prestigious nationwide academic association conferences, and she is the recipient of numerous grants and awards. She's the author of nearly 36 scholarly articles, including quite a few Tier 1 journals. Her first book, Reburying the Past in 2008, explored legal and ethical issues related to repatriating remains. And she returned to that focus in her recent controversial book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, published in 2021 by the University of Florida Press. It provides a provocative declaration of the value of human bones and biological matter in understanding the past. It sailed through peer review, but then ran into an angry Twitter mob alleging racial insensitivity. Efforts to pressure the University of Florida to cancel the text have failed, but Dr. Weiss has remained a strong point of controversy as she dares to ask difficult questions and defend contested positions about the relationship of science and cultural customs. Dr. Elizabeth Weiss.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to say that Repatriation and Erasing the Past came out in 2020. So I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past to fit with the 30-year anniversary of the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I co-authored the book with Jim Springer. He's a retired attorney, so he got to do all the legal aspects of the book, and I got to do all the fun aspects, talking about how we use skeletal remains to reconstruct the past. Our position in our book is a position that we both have held for a long time, that the importance of skeletal remains, of studying of skeletal remains, is too important to leave to oral myths, creation stories, and other types of inaccurate data, or even not even data, but inaccurate tellings. We argue strongly that when you're looking at reconstructing the past or any sciences, that you need to use objective knowledge, and that the person who provides that knowledge, or the person's identity, social identity, is not of consequence. So one of the things we argue in Repatriation and Erasing the Past is that a Native American who tells an oral tradition story is not going to be more accurate than a non-Native American just because they're Native American. We also suggest that the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is unconstitutional in that it violates the First Amendment, specifically separation of church and state. Basically, because NAGPRA requires traditional Indian religious leaders to be on the committees, this is a violation of church and state by supporting one religion over another, traditional Indian religions. So they don't have to only be Native American, but followers of a specific religion. And there are other aspects of NAGPRA that are disconcerting when it comes to the separation of church and state, such as the use of terms sacred and the use of creation myths in order to tie links from modern tribes to past skeletal remains. The book came out in, I believe it was September 2020, and it kind of just, it didn't make that much of a splash until about December, when there was a Twitter campaign against it, an open letter that called for, the original open letter literally called for the book to be banned. They toned the rhetoric down a little bit and said, well, we don't want the book, we're not actually calling for a banning of the book, but rather we just don't want it available for free. So all open access and copies to the library shouldn't exist. Ironically, many of these same people who've signed the open letter have asked each other for a free copy of the book. But I think there's a PDF copy floating around. So it's fine for them to get free copies of the book, but they don't want anybody else to. The open letter was signed by a huge number of people, something like, and it's probably, the list is probably still growing, but by around 900 people, half of which are, which are in the US about, and then about half of which are, or maybe it's more than half who are US, but it's an international movement, so to speak. Half of my colleagues have signed the open letter against the book, which was quite surprising. My department chair felt that he had to address the issue and wrote a letter to my colleagues and to our community on a whole at San Jose State, and using the listserv, basically saying that he supports academic freedom and freedom of speech, but the last paragraph he couldn't help himself and added that he thought the book was Victorian and that I was pre-Cooney and disagreed with the book. So of course, being who I am, I had to reply to that statement. And so at the other thing that my chair did was that he said he was going to do an anti-racism speaker series as a response to my book. So I asked for a counter speaker series, which then he found some guidelines to propose speaker series that we had never used before in our department to try to not get me to have a speaker series of my own. Then things got a little quiet for a little while, right? So this is like December, January. And then the cancel culture activists riled up again at around March or April in regards to a talk I was giving at the Society for American Archaeology. This is a national archaeology conference. And basically, the talk was like a sliver of the book, right? So it was, has creationism been let back into into archaeology? Has it crept back into archaeology? And so what I argued there was that by using creation myths to repatriate bones, specifically creation myths to repatriate bones, that you are using a religious argument, and that this would not be accepted if it wasn't indigenous creationism. So that, and I pointed out how the Society for American Archaeology, the American Association of Physical Anthropology, the American Anthropological Association, all have statements against Christian creationism. However, they seem to have no problem supporting indigenous creationism. One of my pet peeves is hypocrisy and treating two things that are very similar differently, which are tightly together. And so I find it troublesome when people who say that they're against religion actually have no problem with religion in encroaching into science when it's indigenous religion. So either you have no problem with religion encroaching into science, or you have a problem with all religions encroaching into science. So, that was basically the subject matter of my talk. That had a lot of people upset. And basically what happened is that they tried to get the talk canceled. It was pre-recorded, and it was on Zoom, of course, because of COVID, right? It was pre-recorded. And so right before, like 10 minutes before the session, people were sending emails to the ombudsman saying, oh, you have to stop this talk from being shown, it's racist, it's white supremacist, and so forth. Well, the talk went ahead. The first response that the SAA, the Society for American Archaeology, put out was a support of academic freedom and freedom of speech and diversity of opinions. But they then quickly caved in and removed my talk from the platform. So it was deplatformed, and issued an apology. And the two favorite words of most people who are issuing apology, they were promised a transformative journey. I see those two words so often now. It's quite spooky. So they deplatformed my talk. I re-recorded it and posted it on YouTube. And it's gotten, quite a few views, like maybe 1,000 or so, probably more views than had they just let it be. I noticed not everybody listens to the whole talk. I suspect that the people who do, which is like 15% of those, they probably are the archaeologists and anthropologists and other academics, and the others are just kind of curiously dipping in. So a lot of the cancel campaign against me was occurring on Twitter. And I wasn't a Twitter member, didn't have an account. I do now. It's at Weiss Unburied. And one of the reasons why I decided to join Twitter was because I felt that there, so much was going on about me and about the book and so forth. That, I felt that there had to be another voice there. And so I thought, this is a way that I can also provide people with a different perspective. So I did join it. After the SAA, I noticed probably about a month or so later that my chair, being hosted by my dean, were having a session at the Council for Colleges of Arts and Sciences, which is a national organization to help train deans and chairs. And so they had this session that they titled, What to Do when your tenured colleague is branded a racist. Obviously, this was about me. And so I decided to go to this talk. It was registration free. Basically, it was even open. It was an open link, so you didn't have to register at all. And I thought, what to do when your tenured colleague is branded a racist, well, I would say what you do is you stand up for their academic freedom and their freedom of speech and accept that not everybody is going to agree with different perspectives. It's interesting that the reason why I'm branded a racist is basically because I don't think race is important. I'm actually quite surprised that this has been the tone of the attacks on me, because our book really doesn't deal with race. It deals with reburial of remains, mostly Native American remains. And some people might say, well, you know, that is about race, but I would say it's more about religion. Nevertheless, the session that my chair and dean had was about what to do when your tenured colleague is branded racist. And what they basically said, or what my chair basically said, is what you do when that happens is you basically have things like the anti-racism speaker series to show that you're not a racist, or that your department is not. Put down one of these anti-racist statements on your website, and then make sure that she or he does not get any resources, keep resources away from that person. The funny thing is that they changed my name from Professor Weiss to Professor Jones, but it was still obviously me, because the description of me as the physical anthropologist and, you know, so forth. And although I was not surprised that my chair disagreed with my perspective, of course he had already written the letter, I was surprised at how personal and vitriolic even his statements were. You know, he called me odd and not warm and fuzzy, whatever that means. And he basically, you know, tried to paint a picture that I had skeletons in the closet, and literally and figuratively, even though I had always been honest and open about my perspective, and it could not have been a surprise to him that I had this perspective, but he wanted to paint the picture that he had no idea that such a person was in his department. After this event, I felt like I had to reach out to him, because at the end of the event, they were talking about, you know, if I teach these things in my classroom or assign my book, they would take me out of the classroom. And they were comparing my work to lynching, and they said I was a white supremacist. And so I felt like I had to reach out. He wasn't only saying that, but other people in the session were. I had to speak out. So I reached out to him and I said, you know, I went to the talk, and I'm concerned. I'm concerned that my academic freedom and my will be taken away from me. And he basically just kind of brushed it off. I reached out again to him, and he again brushed me off. And that led me to contact Pacific Legal Foundation, who have been helping me through these tangled ways, where, you know, I'm not sure who I can trust to protect my academic freedom, when on one hand they write a letter saying, you know, I stand for academic freedom, and on the other hand, they, behind my back, they call me a racist and say they plan to take me out of the classroom if I teach my things. So basically, after that, and there were a couple other minor incidents that arose that were brought up in the talk. For example, one of my colleagues posted a Cite Black Authors web database, or, you know, search engine, I guess it is, and encouraged people to use this, and including graduate students and alumni. And I had responded to this email, and this happened right around the same time that the Twitter mob was starting to attack the book, but it happened before I was even aware that that was going to be an issue, right? So right around the time that this happened, you know, I had responded to this Cite Black Authors as, you know, although this is well-intentioned, I encourage everyone to cite the best work out there, regardless of the author's race. Well, this was brought up as another evidence that I was racist. And brought up by my chair at the talk as evidence that I was racist. So these things are going on, and the book is still out. It has, it's in about 650 libraries or so. So even though the publishers issued an apology, they did not retract the book. So that was a small success, right? Pacific Legal reached out to my university and wrote them that basically the university should not take any retaliatory actions against me or try to suppress my academic freedom or freedom of speech. So right after that, so this is like maybe September, the provost sent out an email to the university community saying that he's supportive of academic freedom and that speaking in support of the freedom of speech and academic freedom, and that we shouldn't try to shut each other down. I suspect that this was in direct relation to the letter he had received from Pacific Legal Foundation. So thought everything was going good. And then I wrote an op-ed for the Mercury News about CalNAGPRA, which is California's version of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Now, CalNAGPRA is like NAGPRA on steroids in that it doesn't only say that oral history and oral tradition or folklore can be included as evidence. It literally says that indigenous knowledge, including oral history and oral tradition, supersedes any other knowledge from like scientists. And so that basically what we have is we have this kind of putting statements that are indigenous above science, regardless of its validity, because they are indigenous statements. And so where do you go from that, right? So you can have the best scientific study possible that shows a skeletal collection that you look at has no relationship to a modern day tribe. But if they say, well, our oral traditions tell us it does, end of story. So CalNAGPRA was passed several years ago, but it was amended with AB 275 that gave it some real teeth. And so collections are being reburied. So I wrote an op-ed on this, and it got something like 1,000 Twitter comments, almost all of them negative. Most of them, like most of the comments against my position, are just personal attacks, you know, calling me a racist or white supremacist. Also, a lot of personal attacks on appearance, about the condition of my hair or what I'm wearing, which is these are very weak arguments, of course. And I don't know how many times I've been called a grave robber, a ghoul, and so forth. Very little real intellectual argument there. One of the most sensible arguments that sometimes arises, which I actually plan to address in the next article I write, is why don't we just see, why don't we 3D scan these and then print them out with 3D printers? And one of the reasons is because in order to study bones, you actually need to see the inside of the bones a lot of times too. So these 3D models would have to be accurate not only on the outside, but on the inside. And so I recently read a study, for example, where they looked at a single foot. So yes, many bones, but a single foot. And they had to take something like 487 x-rays in order to print out a anatomically correct and individually specific foot. So this is impossible to do with a large skeletal collection. So, but most of the arguments against me, most of the attacks against me have nothing to do with any of the science, but rather are basically just calling me names. So interestingly, after this op-ed, I was working on the skeletal remains, actually trying to ensure that they're properly cared for. And I hadn't been with the skeletal remains for 17 months or so, right, because of COVID. So I was really happy to be back in the lab, genuinely happy. And so I had a photo, I had a camera, I have a little Nikon camera, and I took a photo on a tripod. And I basically took this little photo of me holding a skull that I had just taken out of a box because I was putting back in something else. And I, have this big smile on my face, and I would say, I'm so happy to be back with old friends. And thinking of the term, and I posted this on Twitter, and thinking of the terms as of friends as how we use it in so many cases, like books are old friends sometimes, right? Or we're friends of the library, or friends of the forest. So that was kind of my sense. This erupted, and the same people who were commenting on my op-ed then saw this picture, and they came out with the same attacks as always. And my provost, I guess, the university was contacted. I got some emails about it. And the provost decided to send out an email to the university condemning the photo. And said, oh, well, she's not wearing gloves, she's smiling, she's holding this, and this is not our university standards or policy or morality or so. And I replied to that, and I actually contacted him first, and I said, I was disappointed that he took the position of sending out this response without contacting me first. So I basically sent out a reply, and I showed him the dozens of similar photos from anthropologists. And I explained to him when gloves are used and when not. And then I also said, we've been taking photos like this for a long time at San Jose State, used in promotional materials. I don't know if they still are, but for a while there were even some of these photos on the Muwekma Ohlone tribal webpage. So I said, so I had no idea where he gets the idea that this is unethical, inappropriate. This attracted the attention of the local newspaper. They wrote a big story on it. Came and interviewed me, had many, many phone calls about it with the journalist, and they did a pretty good job of telling the story. I think what was really kind of a little bit muted was the fact that it wasn't the photo at all. It was that this was just another step in the campaign against me. That had I not been smiling, would they have, oh, well, that's okay. Had I been holding a bone from another collection, would they have been okay? Like a non-native collection, would that have been okay? No, of course not. So it's that they're using these opportunities to try to silence me, try to get me fired, try to get me taken out of the classroom, rather than that it really has anything to do with the photo. And it's quite funny because the photo that's used in the promotion of this talk has skeletal remains in the background. I'm not sure that any of them are actually Native American skeletal remains. Maybe one of them is, but most of them are from, like the teaching collections that we got years ago, even before I got here, from like medical suppliers, right? So like the skulls from medical suppliers and so forth, a cut femur and so forth. And some of the people who are against my position, who have been leading this cancel culture attack, whited out or blacked out these images on the flyer, even though this has nothing to do with the Native Americans. If they're arguing that it's about Native Americans, it really doesn't have anything to do with that in these photos. So one of my things is I have a very strong position against reburial. I don't think bones should be reburied. I think they should be studied. I'm not a religious person at all. I understand that some people disagree with me on this perspective, or that a lot of people disagree with me on this perspective. But I think that I would never want to silence those people's perspective. I have no desire to tell people, oh, don't buy that book about repatriation if it's a pro-repatriation book. I have no desire to want to take people who disagree with my perspective out of classrooms. I don't go behind people's back to using the Network Enforcement Act to report on possible hate tweets, as they've done with me. And so I really think that part of it is just an ability to accept that people have different perspectives, and that although people may disagree with me, that silencing a different perspective is not the road to academic debate. And I think that regardless of whether bones are repatriated or not, this experience has really strengthened my resolve to speak out about not only the preservation of skeletal remains, to tell the past as accurately as possible, to reconstruct what these people's lives were like. And anybody who knows me knows that I have a great deal of awe about how people lived in the past, that I'm genuinely curious about their lives. So, but also just in general, if somebody disagrees with you, not to shut them down with hateful personal ad hominem attacks, or try to get books banned, or put in inaccessible formats, or report on people, but rather just have an open discussion and realize that sometimes you're going to walk away disagreeing and agree to disagree. And in the end, what happens with the law and what happens with the data will happen. And I'm going to make the best argument that I can for protection of this material. But in the end, it's my argument, and it shouldn't be silenced. I'd like to say, if other people experience cancel culture attacks, these kind of mob attacks on them for whatever reason, whether it's because of their politics, whether it's because of something they said, whether coming up to Halloween, whether it's what they wore on a Halloween. My advice is to keep your sense of humor, to know that there are many people who support you, and never, never, ever apologize. So that's what I have for the talk. I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. We're receiving questions, and there's a few here, more coming in. But okay. It looks to me like there's kind of two groups of questions.
Okay.
There's some that have to do with your research, folks wanting to know more about your book and what exactly are your arguments, okay. And then others who want to ask about censorship. So could we start maybe by asking about the new book that's controversial, it's angered some people. What would you say is the thesis or maybe some of the core arguments?
I would say that the core argument is that we should be preserving skeletal collections for the study of these remains to best understand the past. And that the past of all populations belongs to humanity in general and not to specific groups. So repatriation and erasing the past, the first section basically lays out the importance of the study of remains. So I talk about, for example, how we look at bones to determine health. DNA studies on skeletal remains, for example, to look at parasite loads or infection rates. So we might be looking at health studies. We might also be looking at craniometrics, so the measurement of the skull to reconstruct who's related to who, of the peopling of the New World, those factors. We might be looking at activity patterns and looking at arthritis and muscle markers to try to determine how people's lives were in the past. But it's also an argument that skeletal studies, a collection should be forever, because you never know what next you're going to learn or what next question you have to answer. For example, just recently, Tallinn Man, who is a bog body, was discovered 70 years ago, but just recently they were able to reanalyze the waste in his intestines that showed that they had, that in addition to the porridge that he was eating, they had added the waste, the thrashing waste of this, which would have made it very bitter and bad tasting. And this is evidence that perhaps he was being punished. So that the study of remains is never complete. There's always more to be found. There's also practical things like we use skeletal remains to refine our methods to understand sex differences. So if a body is discovered, is it a male or female, and try to identify the victim in forensics. So I think that's a big part of the book is just about the use of remains to study the past and how it also can be useful, like in medical research and also forensics. The other aspect of the book is about the laws that are reigning in these kind of research, and then the ideology that fits along with this, the repatriation ideology, where we're now being asked not only to conduct certain types of activities beforehand, certain blessings for the collections beforehand, sage burning and so forth, but also, asking for permission about what we can study, getting approval of the hypotheses, and in the end, getting approval of the publication in case it doesn't agree with the oral traditions. This is very problematic for science, and this is a form of censorship that we should be wary of. So that's part of the book. And in the end, the book is also a call for a return to objective knowledge, to making the case that when we're looking at data, this the most important thing is to see whether the data, the hypothesis that you're trying to answer is answered to the best of its ability. So trying to get at the truth, even if you may never get there, and that where this information comes from, who that information comes from is not important as long as that information is collected in the best possible way and is the most accurate. So whether a white person, measures a bone and comes up with 30 centimeters, or whether a Native American measures the bone, comes up with 15 centimeters, the correct answer will be the correct answer, regardless of whether it's a person did the measurement who's white or Native American. So a call that data is not dependent on the social identity of the researcher. I noticed a very troubling trend in some articles, such as those coming out in Science, where they when they're doing their news reports, that they preface every person or say it afterwards, preface or afterwards, every person's comment with the researcher's race. Elizabeth Weiss, a white anthropologist, says this. You know, what does that have to do with what I have to say? If it is the most accurate information, it's the most accurate information, regardless of my skin color. So that's part of the book. So these things all go together for an argument for using the best methods to understand the past.
Great. So you've articulated your arguments, and it seems like you have the scientific high ground, the rational high ground, but most of the concerns, at least in the comments I'm reading right now even, they're not, as you said, they're not really going in that direction. They're more cultural, or, you know, there's concerns about maybe not being culturally sensitive. And so I want to do those folks all good and read one of those questions for you. Is they're asking, if you're an anthropologist and you're so concerned about learning about the people, why are you not as concerned about their cultural desires today, whether that's scientific or rational or whatever? Put that aside. I mean, do their cultural values matter, and should those matter in the way we handle the remains?
I think that cultural things do matter, but threefold here. One is we're making the assumption that the present day people have the same opinions as the people of the past. Now, this is something that I always am surprised that we don't accept that people in the past may have felt differently. And even within a single group, there may be quite a lot of differences of opinion. So for example, I think it would be erroneous to suggest that all the people that I've studied have the same desires and beliefs than the people they lived with. I don't have the same desires and beliefs with all the people of my culture. Why would this be different in the past? So I do think that although I understand that people have different perspectives, and I think that I'm actually quite sensitive because I acknowledge that, and I never take the position of using names or being mean. I'm always civil to people, even people I disagree with. So I would say I'm actually very sensitive about these things. But I think, so I do think that understanding the past and the difference between the past and the present includes understanding that the people in the present don't necessarily speak for the people in the past. And a group has individual voices. That's the other thing. I mean, one of the things is I get supportive emails every day, and you'd be surprised. I get quite a few emails from Native Americans who are supportive of me. So it's not one unified voice. It never has been, and I don't think it ever will be. And I think that that's an important thing to remember. And I think that sensitivity includes acknowledging diversity.
Great. That reminds me of sort of a couple years ago now, the debate over mascots, and the controversial survey that came out that found that not everyone shared the same opinions, even among Native Americans, and right. It just made it an awkward conversation. But there's diversity, and we should respect that. I see that. That's a great comment. Another one of the questions from a participant says, why is there a continuous need to have the skulls in your possession? What's the harm in returning the skulls respectfully after concluding the research with these skulls that have been in your possession for so long? Shouldn't you already have all the information that you need?
I would say a couple of things. One is that skeletal studies are never complete. So basically, new questions may arise that require new data collection. Re-examining old questions may be another reason to do research again. we might have a new sample that is discovered that needs a comparative sample. The skeletal collection that I done most of my work with, CAALA 329 or the Ryan Mound, has been used in hundreds of studies, not all of them just to look at their past, but also studies, for example, looking at foot arthritis in comparison to Homo habilis. Studies on patterns of bone fusion to help determine age and for forensic anthropologists. So I think that this concept that there's nothing more to be learned is just wrong. I think that we see new data come up on old remains all the time, as the Tollendemand example showed. So I would just say that this concept that you're done is just not accurate. And another thing I want to say about it is one of the accusations I get a lot is like, oh, well, she wants it for her research. One of the most important things that I've done in my 17 years at San Jose State has been to promote the study of the skeletal remains, not for my research, but for young researchers. And before COVID, there was not a single semester that went by where I wasn't contacted from graduate students around the world asking about access to the collection for their theses and dissertations, along with researchers, other professors, and who also came to study the remains. So it's not just about me. I would never presume that it was just about my research, but rather the community's research, the anthropological community's research. And I think that that's really important to remember. I'm going to retire someday, right? The university probably hopes sooner rather than later. But I would hope, and I don't think this is going to happen, but I would hope that that somebody's going to take my place who's interested in skeletal research and continues doing research on remains. So it's absolutely not about ownership. And I never say it's my collection. Rather, it's the collections that are housed at San Jose State University are curated by the university. Now, you might say, well, why don't the Native Americans curate them, right? Why don't give them back and let them decide to curate them? And actually, I would be all for that. I don't think that we need to house them. That's not my position at all. Unfortunately, in all my years as an anthropologist, and I've been looking at repatriation issues for a long time now, over 20 years. And I have never met, and I confess that maybe I'm wrong, in my own personal experience, I have never met somebody who said, yeah, the skeletal remains were repatriated to this tribe and they granted me access, no problem. I've met a lot of people who said, yeah, the remains have been repatriated. They're not yet buried, but they're not letting anybody have access to it. So it's not about where it's housed, it's about access.
Yeah. There's another question on here that's a little bit critical, but it reminds me of something a discussion we had in class today. So in one of my classes today, we read a section from your book and we had discussion about argument and what was and so it was a portion of, I think, chapter 4 or 6, you were discussing population and how DNA and carbon studies and other things can show us a decline in population before the arrival of Columbus, and then that there was a lower population than expected. And as we reread that, you laid out the facts in a way that was convincing, but one of the students noticed that it seemed like there was a reference to Columbus and that maybe you liked Columbus, and it became a discussion. You weren't really getting into whether or not you like Columbus, but it made us wonder. And when we saw how your arguments could be used by folks who have a parallel or adjacent or an extension of that position, and that takes us to the more critical question in the queue here. Someone asks, do they think that your positions could be used to contribute to or justify darker positions, ethnocentrism, or other attitudes that you may not share, but which folks in that camp might be able to use your arguments for?
I think this is a good question. And one of the things is that we cannot control how people will use our information. You know, I think that you could look at all sorts of information from both very liberal professors to very conservative professors, and you'll see that their material has been used in ways that they probably didn't mean for it to be used. I think that you put out the best data that you can find. You analyze it the best you can. You tell the story that you think is most accurate. And if somebody uses that in a negative way, I think that's out of your hands. I mean, you know, history is full of cases like this where actually, you know, people's data was used decades after they even died. And then they were tied to, either communism or fascism through that. And they had nothing to do with it because, you know, you just can't control how your own data is viewed or is used, I should say. You just put out the truth that's the best you can and hope people see it for what it is. I did see like I can't remember where I saw it, but somebody criticized me for not talking more about Columbus in the book, right? So, but am I a secret Christopher Columbus fan, right? And the funny thing is that the reason why I didn't is because almost everything I look at is pre-contact. So it's like before Columbus got there, right? So, so in a sense, you know, you can't, in any book, there's going to be gaps. And I did talk a little bit about the diseases that Columbus did bring over. And so that was like a little bit there. But I just think like, you know, you can't touch upon everything. And so most of the skeletal collections in America and the US are pre-contact.
Okay, another question from, I think, perhaps a faculty somewhere. He says, many of the faculty work from semester to semester without any guarantees of future work, and they might not get more sections, and they'll never know if it's because of discrimination or retaliation, or if there just weren't enough sections. And so this person's asking what advice you might have, if there's anything that they can do or what they should try to do. Should they defend their positions? Should they just roll over? What's the best strategy for these vulnerable faculty?
You know, one of the reasons why I feel like I have to be so vocal is in part because I do have tenure, and I'm grateful for that. I think that this problem with faculty from one semester to another who are so reliant on the whims of somebody who, you know, who might have a talk about them, about how they're a racist, is very problematic. I think that if you think that you're being discriminated against for your perspective, that the best thing is to look into legal help. You know, one of the organizations is FIRE, and they do a lot of assisting students and non-tenured faculty, pro bono, of course, to ensure that our academic freedoms are protected. I also think, you know, rally up your troops and, you know, try to find supporters, people who are going to be on your side. Hopefully some of them are tenured faculty who will help. I completely understand that some people are not in the position to stand up or to speak out. That makes it all the more important for those who can to do so.
Great. Well, we are running out of time, so I want to ask one short question and then also leave you with something that one of our participants wrote. But
Okay.
first, the question, what's the next book project? Is there another big plan?
Oh, I don't know what the next book project is. I suspect that there will be another book project very soon. I might write a book about all my experiences with the cancel culture. It's so hard to say. Right now, I write all the time. I I have a feeling that I need to write. I feel like, every like 3 days when I haven't written something, I'm like, I haven't written anything in so long, So it's like a compulsion almost. And I do write op-eds and so forth continuously. My latest one is actually on Liberty Unbound. And it is a Halloween piece called Invasion of the Freedom Snatchers. If you get a chance to look that up, it's a kind of a fun read. So we'll see if I do write a book about all of this experience, and I might have to wait to see how it all turns out. I don't know what's going to happen with repatriation and erasing the past. If the University of Florida Press decides not to renew it after the 3 or 4 years, whatever, Jim and I have said that we would definitely find someone else to publish it. We definitely update it. We definitely include a foreword that talks about the controversy it raised and so forth. So that's another aspect of it. I'm working with a couple of people on ideas about a more popular anthropology book to try to get people to see the importance of anthropology, not only physical, but cultural as well, cultural, physical, linguistics. And we're thinking about a variety of topics to bring in the public. I think forensics got such a big hit with all their public attention that we could do the same for other fields of anthropology.
Great. Well, we are pretty well out of time, but I do want to leave you with a comment from many of the participants. Some of them you might guess were fairly critical. Others were actually really warm and supportive. And so I want to tell you thank you by leaving you with one of these more warm and supportive comments. Someone wrote, she's amazing and handles the negativity with such grace and professionalism. She has answered all questions with facts and proof. She is beyond reasonable and understanding, while others attack her personally, not academically. I can't wait to check out her book. Dr. Weiss, thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a great evening, everybody.
You too. Good night.
Good night.